This sermon today is a plea to my beautiful and broken and beloved American Jewish community. A plea to those whose hearts have been full of anguish these past 8 months, to those pained every day by the unthinkable losses suffered by our family in Israel, and to those pained every day by the horrific losses suffered by Palestinians in Gaza, for you too are part of our Jewish family. And of course, to those who are pained by all of it, those who see the death of even one innocent, any innocent, as a moral catastrophe, and have spent these past many months reeling, navigating the spiritual whiplash and political homelessness caught between those who feel and really feel one or the other, and left feeling lonely and heartbroken and breathless from all of it. This sermon is a plea to those who believe that, like the silent scream of a nightmare, we are powerless now to do anything to temper the tide that is crashing on this tender, fragile shore. Powerless to do much more than just watch in horror as it all unfolds. And this sermon is especially a plea to those who feel increasingly unmoored, helpless, hopeless. This sermon is for you. A plea from my broken heart to yours. I want to start by telling you 2 stories from long ago. The first takes place in the town of Yodfat, a small agricultural community, a moshav today, of a couple hundred families in the lower Galilee. Today, you don't hear a lot about Yodfat. What the town is most known for is what took place there nearly 2,000 years ago. Seeking safe haven from the encroaching Roman army, much of the Jewish military and many Jewish refugees fled to Yodfat in 67 CE, more than 41,000 people in total. Josephus Flavius, was among them, a Jewish general who was known at the time as Yosef ben Matityahu. His writing gives us the broad strokes of the nightmare that unfolded in that town when the Romans laid siege to it. Fear, devastation, and desperation. As the siege worsened, Josephus determined that surrender was the only option in order to save their lives. But his fellow warriors did not agree. They were so committed to fighting to the death that when he called for compromise, they drew their swords on him and they threatened to kill him themselves rather than surrender to the Romans. Ultimately, it is those colleagues who were killed, every last one of them, by the Romans. Josephus escaped, making his way to Vespasian Caesar to plead for his life. A second similar story is told of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in that same war against that same enemy, just a few kilometers away and just a few years later. Rabbi Yochanan was in Jerusalem, where the Romans besieged that city, not for 47 days, but for nearly 5 long months. The account of this siege is told in Masechet Gittin in the Talmud. The sages determined that they had to leave the gates of the city and try to make peace with the Romans. Havu bahu hanhu biryone, but there were certain zealots, biryonim, among the people of Jerusalem, and those zealots would not allow the sages to surrender. The people of Jerusalem pooled their resources. They calculated how long they could hold out with the wheat and the water that they had. The 3 wealthiest people in Jerusalem generously supported the entire community from their riches. But this only infuriated those zealots, the biryonim, whom Rashi describes as anashim rekim ufochzim lemilchama, empty people who were eager only for war. So eager for war, in fact, that in order to force the residents of the city to engage in battle and not strive for peace, the zealots arose and burned down those storehouses of wheat and barley until there was a general famine in Jerusalem. The zealots were determined to bring the people to the breaking point, fight to victory, or die trying. This is when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai called for a clandestine meeting with the head of the Zealots, a man named Abba Sikara, who happened to be his nephew because families are complicated. "What are you doing?" he said to his nephew. "This war needs to end." But the machinery of the Zealots was already in motion, and even their leader, Abba Sikara, was powerless against them. "What can I do?" Abba Sikara said to his uncle. "Even if I try to say something to the Zealots, they will turn their swords on me and kill me." And that's when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew that it was over. It was too late. These extremists would rather die than compromise. And they had no qualms about bringing all of Jerusalem and the temple and more than 1 million people down with them. The only way to survive was for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, humbled and heartbroken, to play dead and somehow escape the city before it was too late. And once outside, he, like Josephus before him, surrendered to Vespasian Caesar and was miraculously, perhaps providentially, saved. As one scholar notes in analyzing these two surprisingly similar stories, the similarity of these narratives teaches more about memory than it does about history. So the question I want to ask today is, what are we to learn from these two stories about Jewish memory? First, this is clearly a call to empathy. Remember, the text seems to be crying out to us. You know what it is like to be besieged by a fierce army outside and extremists inside, surrounded by destruction. You know, we know what it is like to have no food and no water, no way out, no time to grieve and no future. Find in your hearts, these stories call to us, find room for those who cower today in tents and in classrooms, in Rafah, in Nuseirat, lying awake each night praying that they will see the morning come, even as they know that the new day offers neither safety nor consolation. Keep them in your hearts, for you too have been besieged, and they too are images of the Holy One. But that's not all that these stories come to tell us. This twice repeated narrative issues not only a lesson in empathy, but also a warning for our time. It was the Romans who were responsible for the catastrophe that our ancestors endured 2,000 years ago. But our sacred tradition chooses to focus our attention on the dark truth that our own extremists were the ones who fomented that violence. That extremism, history warns us, is the greatest threat to Jewish survival. The destruction of the temple, the Khorban, the exile, all of this could perhaps have been averted were we not besieged by those zealots in our own community. These stories cry out to us from a dark and pained past. Remember, even when external enemies surround us, it is the extremism from within that prevents us from making clear-headed and responsible decisions, from compromising, from seeing any way out other than endless war and certain death. Last week, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, we read a lengthy list of curses that would befall the Jewish people if we failed to obey God. And one of those curses says the following: "As for those of you who survive, I will cast a faintness into your hearts in the land of your enemies. The sound of a driven leaf will put you to flight. You will fail to stand your ground before your enemies. You will perish among the nations, consumed in their land." And there it is. There it is, preserved for all time in our most sacred text, the image of a passive, powerless, diasporic Jewry consumed by fear and moral panic. The trembling, powerless Jew. The Jew of the Kishinev pogrom, at least in the imagination of Chaim Nachman Bialik in City of Slaughter. But that Jew, Bialik's Jew, the Jew who is raped and massacred, who lives perpetually in fear, that Jew birthed a new Jew, one who is not a passive victim of history, but its conductor, one who is strong and sovereign and certain, unapologetic, unafraid. Was not the proud claim of the post-Holocaust era that Jews would no longer passively witness the unfolding of history, but instead we would muster every resource, spiritual and material, to bend the arc of history ourselves. Now, perhaps it's inevitable that profound powerlessness, the crematoria, would birth an untempered yearning for power. But be careful. Josephus and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai are warning us, for there is a fine and fading line between power and abuse of power, between strength and fanaticism, between protecting oneself and worshiping military force as the only force in this universe worth worshiping, between defending oneself and recklessly endangering others' lives. Beware that blurry line. Now, every tradition, every religious tradition has its fringe and marginal voices. But in our Jewish community over the past several years, those who boast a radical, messianic, power-driven vision that is anathema to both our deepest Jewish and democratic commitments have migrated from the margins to the mainstream, from provocateurs to policymakers, from gadflies to government officials. And their violent rhetoric and their violent actions, their fantasy of a fascist theocracy in Israel, pose an existential danger not only to the state of Israel, but to the Jewish people. One can acknowledge this without relieving Hamas of responsibility for the atrocities of October 7th. Despite the word on the street and in the halls of our great universities, there is no cause, no matter how righteous, that justifies the rape, abduction, and murder of innocents. And even still, our very future depends on our honest recognition that there exists not one, but two camps of violent extremists today, one on either side of the trampled fence that separates Israel and Gaza. Two camps of extremists who are locked now in a brotherhood of mutually assured destruction. Two camps with a profound disregard for human life and a shared commitment to eternal war. And both of them claim to be acting in God's name, as if one could possibly honor God while destroying human life created in God's own image. On Israel's side of the fence, the most extreme voices have been handed the power and the platform to address the world on behalf of the Jewish people, bringing great shame upon our people, promoting endless war, endangering all of our lives and endangering the future of this state. And so who can be surprised when we see extremists today stopping aid convoys and tearing open bags of flour and stomping on food, puncturing tires and threatening drivers? Or thousands of young people this past week, draped in flags, rampaging through the Muslim quarter of the Old City, vandalizing and threatening Arab shop owners. Who can be surprised when we hear an arsonist minister of national security who gleefully threatens to smash the fragile status quo on the Temple Mount, knowing well that that would lead to World War III? Or a finance minister who is withholding taxes from the Palestinian Authority because to hell with the law and basic morality. And the rabbis who remain silent as starvation is justified as a tactic of war, and the journalists who mock the death of innocents as if only Jewish blood is red. From the margins to the mainstream, indeed. And these extreme ideas in ancient times and now are utterly intoxicating. They are norm shifting. But even still, this story is not yet done. And we, you and I, might feel helpless and hopeless, but we are not. Extremism gets its fuel from the silence and the moral confusion of decent people. It relies on good people equivocating in the face of profound human suffering. It counts on us shifting the blame, denying the pain, accepting justifications for human heartache. We must know that these behaviors only contribute to the moral vacuum that today violent extremism is filling. Last week, a group of Israeli mothers of combat soldiers sent a powerful message to Israel's leaders. Stop, they said. Stop. Enough. We need a negotiated political solution. We need to get our hostages home. Every day, more soldiers are killed and wounded, and more Palestinian civilians are suffering and dying too. They fear that they and their sons are caught in a chad gadya that is driven by ideas not unlike the ones that Josephus and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai confronted in their time. This no way out, war or bust, do or die kind of extremism, this mentality that leads to nothing but death and heartache and more death. This week, those mothers found that their plea was joined by families of the hostages, Kulanu Chatufim, in a country that is today led by empty people, eager for war. Those families are pleading with us, American Jews, to help. They say, we are out of time. We need you, American Jews, to publicly speak out for us. We need you to call for a deal, a ceasefire, to end this war. We need more than sympathy. We need your support. They're talking to us, friends. Stand with us at this critical moment, they say, and publicly call on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to accept the hostage deal that is currently on the table. And this war, end this war, and prevent extremist factions from further harming and endangering our families. Kulanu Chatufim, we are all hostages to this war. We beg of you, they write. Please do not forsake our families in captivity in Gaza. Do not forsake us. We are out of time. President Biden has put forward a proposal, not only for a ceasefire, but for a durable end to this conflict. This is a comprehensive proposal that will finally bring all of the hostages home, that will build a day after in Gaza for the millions of people who are suffering there today, and will advance a political settlement that provides a better future for everyone, Israelis and Palestinians alike. The most extreme elements of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government have threatened to leave the government if he agrees to this deal, even though the deal was initiated by Israelis themselves, which makes the decision before us extremely clear. President Biden's deal is the counterpoint to the Armageddon that has been promised by those zealots. It is an escape route from endless war and endless heartache. This is the vision of those mothers. This is the vision of the Israelis and Palestinians who have now been protecting those humanitarian convoys with their bodies, together working to ensure that the food will arrive safely and everyone who's hungry will be able to be fed. This is the vision of Rachel Goldberg-Polin, whom we have quoted in this place again and again over the last 8 months, who pleaded last week with the world that with all eyes on Rafah, please keep eyes out too for Kfir Bibas, who's 1.5 years old, and his brother Ariel, who's 4, and Naama Levi, and Omer Nutras, and Hirsch Goldberg-Polin too, her son. This requires imagining a different kind of future, one that is built not on power and victory at all costs, but on justice, on human dignity, and peace. One that is driven not by religious actors who claim Torah as their inheritance and yet fail to see every human being in God's own image, but instead by those who are willing to grieve together, to live together, and to rebuild together. Israel and Palestine cannot achieve that future alone. Let it not be said, when the history of our time is written, that in the face of the greatest threat to Jewish life in our time, our diaspora Jewish community failed to stand up to our own extremists. This story is not yet over. There's still time for us to assert that there's another way, The way not of war, but of peace, not of degradation and dehumanization, but of dignity, not of extremism, but of compassion and reason. This sermon is a plea to the American Jewish community. Please recognize that we are at an inflection point, and today we must decide, will we once again fall prey to the zealots, to those who wish to burn the whole world to the ground so they can stand on the ashes and declare victory? Or will we take this lifeline? The president's plan is the hope, and it may be our last great hope, our chance to push back against the encroaching darkness before it's too late. So this sermon is a plea. Please, let us raise our voices to end this ghastly war, to bring home the hostages, to save the people of Gaza from famine, and to lay the groundwork for a just, shared future for Israelis and for Palestinians alike. Shabbat Shalom.